Late afternoon, 1885. The autumn wind blew harsh across the Wyoming ranch, carrying with it a sense of warning that Horace couldn't shake. He was out mending a fence, his hands steady and practiced, but his mind was elsewhere. It had been 6 months since Marcus, his younger brother, died in a horse accident, but the weight of it still pressed heavily on him. Since that day, Horace had stayed busy, keeping the ranch running, avoiding the memories of his brother's death. But something in the wind today felt different. Something was wrong. There was no smoke rising from Marcus's cabin across the valley, and it had been 3 days since anyone had seen a sign of life from it. The silence from the cabin gnawed at him, a knot of guilt tightening in his chest. He hadn't seen Alyssa, his brother's widow, in all that time. In the small town nearby, people whispered behind their hands about her. They called her cursed, the widow of a man who died too young, as if she was somehow to blame. His family, his parents, had gone even further. They turned their backs on her. She was a burden, they said, a bad omen. They'd locked her away in that cabin, stopped sending her food, and abandoned her to whatever fate the world had in store for her. Horace had told himself it wasn't his problem. His own grief had been too much to bear, and he'd convinced himself that staying away was easier for everyone. But today, something inside him broke. The wind whispered warnings, and the silence from the cabin felt like a cry for help. He mounted his horse, his heart heavy with uncertainty. The distance between his ranch and Marcus's cabin seemed longer than it ever had before. The wild grasses of the prairie stretched endlessly before him, the distant mountains a backdrop to his troubled thoughts. He couldn't help but remember the last time he'd seen his brother, an argument that still stung. He'd been angry, and Marcus had been insistent. But the fight hadn't seemed important at the time. He never imagined it would be the last conversation they'd ever have. As he approached the cabin, the unease in his gut deepened. The shutters were closed, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned and neglected. He dismounted and approached the porch, noticing the door slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine. Something wasn't right. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The darkness inside hit him first, the air stale and thick like the weight of years of neglect. His eyes adjusted, and the sight that greeted him shook him to his core. The cabin was a mess. Furniture overturned, empty food tins scattered across the floor, a faint smell of decay in the air. And then he saw her, Alyssa. She was sitting on the floor, her face gaunt and pale, her hair tangled and matted, her dress hanging off her fragile frame like a shadow of its former self. Her wide eyes met his, full of fear, confusion, and shame. She barely spoke, her voice weak and trembling. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to worry anyone." Her apology cut deeper than any scream ever could. Horace's heart clenched. She had been surviving on creek water and whatever scraps she could find, abandoned by the very people who should have been there to care for her. It was then that the full weight of his family's cruelty hit him. Marcus had died 6 months ago, and in that time, Alyssa had been cast aside, left to wither away. His parents, her in-laws, had done this to her. They had blamed her for Marcus's death, calling her a curse, a burden on the family. They had locked her away here and stopped sending food. The townspeople, too, had turned their backs on her, gossiping about her misfortune, but never lifting a finger to help. For the first time in his life, Horace saw the truth. His silence, his avoidance had allowed this to happen. He had let his family's hatred for her dictate his actions. And now, she was a shadow of the woman Marcus had married, starving and broken. He took a step forward, his voice steady but urgent. "Drink." He held out his canteen. Alyssa shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't deserve." "You do," Horace interrupted firmly but gently. "You do." She took the canteen with trembling hands, drinking deeply as if the very act of survival was a foreign concept to her. The tears that welled up in her eyes were as much for the food as they were for the kindness she had long since stopped expecting. Horace's mind raced. He had to get her out of here. He couldn't leave her like this. The woman who had once been his sister-in-law, the woman who had once loved his brother, was now a ghost of herself. The guilt gnawed at him, but the anger toward his family for their cruelty, burned brighter. "Pack whatever belongings you have. You're coming with me," he said. Alyssa shook her head, fear in her eyes. "People will talk. Your parents will. My parents don't control my choices." "Not anymore," Horace said, his voice low and resolute. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. Horace rushed to catch her, lifting her in his arms. She was so light, so fragile. For a moment, they stood there, frozen, her frailty pressed against his strength. And in that moment, something changed in Horace. He made a silent vow, one he couldn't take back. He would protect her, no matter what it cost him. But neither of them knew, as they left the cabin behind, that the storm was only just beginning. A dangerous truth about Marcus's death was waiting to emerge, and it would test everything Horace believed about loyalty, family, and love. As he lifted Alyssa onto his horse, the sun dipped low on the horizon. The world around them was quiet, but within, a new storm was brewing. The ride back to Horace's ranch was slow, the journey heavier than either of them had anticipated. Alyssa, too weak to ride on her own, sat in front of him on the horse, her body slumped against his chest. The wind whipped around them, the sound of their horses' hooves the only noise breaking the heavy silence. Horace's hand gripped the reins tightly, his mind spinning with thoughts of what had happened. She had looked so broken back there, a shadow of the vibrant woman he had once known. His heart ached for her, but there was little time to mourn. As they passed the edge of the small town, Horace noticed the eyes of the townspeople on them, watching, whispering. He could feel the weight of their judgment in the air, and he knew the gossip had already begun. A woman shouted from her porch, her voice sharp and cruel. "Bringing home your brother's leftovers, Horace?" The word stung, but Horace didn't flinch. He kept his eyes ahead, tightening his grip around Alyssa to reassure her, but she trembled against him, her shame palpable. The whispers were loud enough for her to hear, and he knew they were impossible to ignore. It hurt him to see how deeply it affected her. As they approached his ranch, the familiar sight of the small but well-kept home brought a fleeting sense of comfort. Horace dismounted first, then helped Alyssa down with care, holding her steady as they entered the house. The warmth of the fire crackled on the hearth, but there was no warmth in the coldness that surrounded them. He settled her into a chair by the fire, her frame so fragile it seemed she might break at any moment. She watched him with wide, uncertain eyes as he prepared a simple meal for her. The broth was warm, and for the first time in days, she seemed to relax as she ate. Her fingers trembled with each spoonful, her face gaunt, but some of the color started to return to her cheeks. The silence between them stretched out, neither sure of what to say. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Horace paused, the question catching him off guard. He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. "Because it's right," he answered simply, then added, "You'll stay here in the guest room. You'll be safe." Her eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and uncertainty. "Your parents will come. They won't touch you," he interrupted, his voice firm. He could see the fear in her eyes, but his resolve was unwavering. This was no longer about what his family thought or what anyone in town believed. It was about doing what was right. He would protect her, no matter the cost. That night, as they sat by the fire, the conversation turned to what came next. Horace, after a long silence, finally spoke again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I have a solution," he said, looking at her with a quiet determination. Alyssa tilted her head, confused, unsure of what he meant. "A solution?" she repeated, her voice soft. Horace nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Marry me," he said simply. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Alyssa's eyes widened with shock. What? She gasped, her voice trembling. No, I can't. Listen to me, Horace cut in, his tone firm but kind. As my wife, you'll have legal protection under my name. My family won't be able to remove you, won't be able to harm you. The town will have to accept it. It would be a marriage of convenience. No expectations, just safety. Alyssa stared at him, her mind reeling. A marriage of convenience? To you. She shook her head, her heart heavy with disbelief. You deserve someone you actually care for. Horace. Not this. You're not a burden, Alyssa, Horace replied, his voice gentle but resolute. You're not cursed. You're a survivor, and I'm asking because no one else will. No one else has. He kneeled beside her chair, his eyes level with hers. This ranch is too big for one person anyway. You'd be doing me a favor, bringing life back to this place. Alyssa's eyes filled with tears. Why me? She whispered, her voice trembling. Why risk everything for me? Horace's expression softened, a quiet vulnerability creeping into his features. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke with a raw honesty that surprised both of them. Because when I found you today, barely alive, I realized I'd been dead too, just in a different way. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing, his voice thick with emotion. Maybe we can survive better together. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, it felt like a weight had been lifted. Alyssa's walls began to crack. The desperation in his eyes, the raw honesty in his voice, it stirred something deep inside her. Slowly, as if unsure of herself, she nodded. Okay, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I'll marry you. Tomorrow. Before anyone can interfere. The relief on Horace's face was palpable, but neither of them spoke for a long moment. They sat in the silence, the crackling fire the only sound between them. The bond between them was fragile, but it was there, forged in the uncertainty of their situation. The quiet was broken by the sound of wheels crunching in the dirt outside. Horace's expression hardened, and Alyssa tensed, instinctively shrinking back into the chair. Your parents, she whispered, her fear rising again. They'll never let us do this. Horace stood up, his face set. We're not asking permission, he said firmly. We're doing this. The door swung open, and his mother stormed in, her eyes wild with fury. What is this madness we're hearing? She demanded, her voice sharp. His father followed, his expression dark with anger. You will not marry that woman, he barked, his words like a slap in the face. Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest, but Horace stood tall, unwavering. I'm not asking for your permission, he said quietly but firmly, his gaze never leaving his parents' faces. His brother James stepped forward, his face twisted with accusation. She killed Marcus, he shouted. Everyone knows it. Horace's jaw clenched, but he didn't shout back. Marcus died in an accident, he said coldly, and you left his widow to starve. His mother, still furious, threw her hands up in the air. She's bad luck, she cried. She'll destroy you too. Horace's voice was low, but steady. Then that's my choice to make. He turned toward the door. Leave my property. His father and James stared at him, their faces full of shock and disbelief, but there was nothing more to say. They turned and left, muttering threats under their breath. Horace and Alyssa stood in the silence that followed, both shaken by the confrontation. As they rode toward town the next morning to be married, neither of them noticed the dark look exchanged between his brothers. A look that promised the storm was far from over. And the secret they carried about Marcus's death, it was about to surface in the worst possible way. The ceremony was simple, almost too simple for the weight of the decision they had made. The justice of the peace's office was small and dusty, filled with the smell of old wood and ink. The air felt thick with tension, and neither Horace nor Alyssa had the words to fill the silence between them. Alyssa wore a borrowed dress, still too thin, her frame still fragile. while Horace stood beside her in his best shirt, his hat in hand, looking every bit the man who had spent years alone, not knowing what it meant to share his life with another. The only witnesses were the store owner and his wife, both kind-hearted people who had known Horace for years and had come to show their support. The vows were brief, their words more about duty than affection. When the justice asked if they took each other, Horace answered without hesitation, his voice firm, "I do." But when it was Alyssa's turn, her voice barely made it past a whisper, "I do." The formality of it all made her feel distant, removed, as if she were watching a scene play out from far away. But in a way, it was for the best. She didn't want to feel too much. She couldn't afford to. When the justice declared them married and motioned for them to kiss, the pause felt like an eternity. Neither of them moved at first, unsure of what was expected. But finally, Horace leaned down and gently kissed her forehead, the touch as careful as if he were afraid to break something fragile. She closed her eyes, feeling an unexpected warmth flood through her chest. They signed the papers, the deed done, but neither of them felt much like celebrating. As they left the justice's office, they were met by a small crowd of curious onlookers, their reactions a mix of surprise, gossip, and judgment. Some looked on with pity, others with open disapproval, but none said a word as the newlyweds walked out of the building. The town had seen enough to form its opinions, and in their eyes, the marriage was nothing more than a scandal. As Horace and Alyssa made their way back to the ranch, the silence between them felt heavier than it had been before. They had just made the biggest decision of their lives, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a long road ahead, one neither of them had ever intended to travel. The first day back at the ranch was awkward, filled with small, uncertain gestures. Horace had never been one to share his space with anyone, and Alyssa, still weak and uncertain of herself, wasn't sure where she belonged in this strange new life they had begun together. He showed her to the guest room, a small, simple room with a bed and a chair, a place she could rest and recover, though it didn't feel like hers. She nodded her thanks, but didn't speak, unsure of what to say. The house felt too large now, too empty for two people who barely knew how to coexist. Later, in the kitchen, the awkwardness was palpable. Horace tried to prepare a simple dinner, but he found himself bumping into Alyssa at every turn. She offered to help, but he was used to doing everything on his own. The result was a clumsy dance around the small kitchen, both of them apologizing whenever they got in each other's way. When dinner was finally ready, they ate in silence, the quiet between them thick with unspoken words. It wasn't that either of them minded the other's company, but there was an invisible wall between them that neither knew how to break. After the meal, Horace led her back to the guest room. "If you need anything," he said, his voice softer than it had been earlier, "I'm just across the hall." She nodded, her gaze distant. "Thank you, Horace, for everything," she said, but there was a sadness in her voice that he couldn't ignore. He didn't know how to make it better. That night, the house was too quiet. Horace lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had married Alyssa out of duty, to protect her, to give her a place where she could heal. But somewhere in the back of his mind, something else had begun to stir. He had seen the fragile woman she had become, but there had been moments of something else, too. A flicker of the woman she used to be, the woman his brother had loved. She was strong in ways he hadn't expected, and he found himself thinking more about her than he should. But he pushed those thoughts away. This wasn't about love. It was about protection. Alyssa, on the other hand, lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling just as Horace did, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear, uncertainty, and something else she couldn't quite name. She had agreed to marry him, but she wasn't sure if it was the right choice. She wasn't sure of anything. It had all happened so fast, and the reality of their situation was starting to sink in. She had never expected her life to turn out like this, had never imagined that she would become a burden to someone, even if that someone was her late husband's brother. She had never wanted to be anyone's responsibility. And yet, here she was, a woman without a future, trying to make a life with a man she barely knew. But the warmth of his presence, the quiet assurance that he was there to protect her, settled in her chest, and she allowed herself to feel the smallest bit of peace. The next day, a strange new rhythm began to form between them. Alyssa, despite her reservations, started helping around the ranch. She woke early and made breakfast, surprising Horace with her quiet efficiency. He had never expected her to be so capable, and for the first time since they had started this arrangement, the air between them felt a little lighter. She swept the porch while he tended to the horses, and when he brought in some wildflowers from the field, she smiled and placed them in a small jar on the table. It wasn't much, but it was something. They were learning to share space, to live together, and it felt strangely comfortable. Of course, there were still awkward moments, times when they bumped into each other in the kitchen or when their conversations faltered, but there was a shift happening, something small but significant. The walls between them were slowly starting to crack, and it scared Alyssa more than she wanted to admit. She had agreed to this marriage for protection, for safety, but as the days passed, she realized that what had begun as a practical arrangement was starting to feel like something more. The moments when their hands brushed, when their eyes met across the room, stirred something inside her that she didn't know how to handle. She tried to push it aside. This was just a marriage of convenience, after all. But the more time she spent with Horace, the more difficult it became to ignore the connection that was quietly forming between them. It was dangerous, she knew, but she couldn't help the way she felt. 2 weeks passed, and despite the awkwardness of their beginnings, a quiet rhythm began to form in their daily life. The ranch, once a place of cold solitude for Horace, now hummed with a subtle warmth that neither of them had anticipated. Alyssa, looking healthier, had regained some strength, and there were moments when she smiled, though it was still a rare thing. Horace noticed it, and it filled him with a strange sense of pride. He had never expected to care so much about someone he had married out of duty. One evening, after they had shared a simple but hearty dinner, Alyssa seemed different. Her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the meal. She stood at the stove, washing the dishes, her movements steady and sure. She had regained some of her former strength, and it was evident in the way she moved. As Horace sat near the fire, watching her, he couldn't help but notice how her presence seemed to fill the house, making it feel more like a home. After a while, she set the dish rag down and turned to face him, her face a little more serious now. "Horace, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice soft but trembling with something he couldn't place. He looked at her with concern, setting his mug down on the table and giving her his full attention. "Of course," he answered, his tone steady, though a nervousness gnawed at him. Alyssa hesitated for a moment, her eyes dropping to the floor, then back up to his. "Do you regret marrying me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, as though she was afraid of the answer. Horace stared at her, his heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the question he had expected, but he couldn't lie. "What? No," he said quickly, his voice firm. "Why would you?" "Because you barely look at me," she interrupted, her words coming out a rush. "You keep your distance. If this marriage is a burden to you—" "It's not a burden, Alyssa," he said, cutting her off, his tone more intense than he admitted it to be. "That's not why I keep my distance." She blinked, surprise flashing her eyes, but she pressed on, her voice barely audible. "Then why?" The question hung in the air like a weight between them. He swallowed hard, unsure of how to answer, but in the silence, something broke inside him. He stood up, walking toward her, his face softening. "Because if I get too close," he trailed off, his throat tight with the admission. She raised an eyebrow, confusion still written across her features. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaky. Horace took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He couldn't keep pretending this was just about duty anymore. "Because if I get too close, this stops being just protection. And I don't want to pressure you into something you don't want." The vulnerability in his voice was something he had never allowed himself to show. Alyssa's eyes softened, the walls between them beginning to crack. "What if I want more than protection?" she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Horace's heart raced. He had never imagined she would feel the same way. His mind swirled with a mix of disbelief and something else, something warmer, something he had tried to suppress for days now. He stepped closer, his voice low, a quiet urgency in his words. "Say it, please." Her breath caught in her throat, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I know this started as convenience, but when you're near, I feel." Her voice faltered, and she hesitated, unsure of how to finish. Horace took her hands in his, urging her gently. "What do you feel?" Alyssa closed her eyes, fighting the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't look at him as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Safe. Alive. Like maybe I could be happy again." Horace's breath caught in his chest. He reached out, cupping her face gently, and for the first time since their marriage, he let himself truly see her, really see her. His voice was raw, filled with the depth of emotions he had kept buried for far too long. "I feel it too. Every damn day." The words were out before he could stop them, and then, without thinking, he leaned forward and kissed her, tenderly, urgently, full of longing. The kiss was unlike any other they had shared. It was a confession, an acknowledgement of everything that had been building between them in the silence. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something real, something neither of them had expected. When they pulled away, both of them were breathless, their hearts racing. Neither spoke, but the tension that had once hung between them had disappeared. Alyssa looked at him, a tear slipping down her cheek, but there was a softness in her eyes now. "You don't know what this means to me," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and relief. Horace, his hand still resting gently on her cheek, smiled, his own eyes shining with emotion. "I think I do," he said softly. That night, for the first time since they had married, they slept in the same bed, side by side, but it wasn't the awkward, distant arrangement it had been before. It felt natural, comfortable. They talked late into the night, their words becoming the bridge that closed the distance between them. Alyssa traced the lines of Horace's scars with gentle fingers, and he braided her hair, both of them finding a strange, quiet peace in the simple intimacy they had found. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was something real. The next day, the awkwardness had lifted completely. They worked together in silence, but there was a new ease between them, an understanding that hadn't been there before. He showed her how to tend to the horses, and she helped him with the chores around the ranch. They shared small moments. Her laughter as she mended one of his torn shirts, his smile when she found a new wildflower in the field. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, but it was enough. And though neither of them knew it yet, the town's judgment and the secrets of the past were about to catch up with them, bringing a new set of challenges they couldn't anticipate. The darkness of Marcus's death was still hanging over them, and soon they would be forced to face it. But for that moment, in the quiet of the ranch, Horace and Alyssa were content. They were building something together, and it felt like the beginning of a life neither of them had ever thought they would have. The peace they had built was short-lived, shattered by the distant sound of galloping hooves in the quiet of the night. Horace had just returned from the barn, his thoughts drifting to Alyssa as he wiped his hands on his pants. It had been a long day, but the weight of their unspoken understanding between them had settled into a comfortable silence. As he walked toward the house, he froze, his instincts kicking in. He could hear them, his brothers, James and Robert, coming up the dirt road toward the ranch, the sound of their horses growing louder with each passing second. His heart sank. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. He turned quickly, heading toward the house, but as he did, his gaze met Alyssa's in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Without a word, She stepped back inside, disappearing from view, and Horace felt a wave of protectiveness surge through him. "Get inside," he called over his shoulder, his voice low and urgent. He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He knew she would. The last thing he needed was for her to get caught up in whatever confrontation was about to unfold. He reached the front yard just as the riders appeared at the edge of the property. The shadows of his brothers loomed large against the dimming sky, their figures taking shape as they drew closer. James, the older of the two, led the charge, his face twisted with anger and something darker. Horace stood tall, his jaw clenched, bracing himself for whatever was coming. The air was thick with tension. James pulled his horse to a halt, sneering at Horace. "Well, look at you," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Got yourself a little wife now, did you? Bringing home the leftovers from Marcus's grave." His words cut deeper than Horace cared to admit, but he didn't flinch. He had heard worse from his family, and this wasn't going to break him. Robert, his younger brother, rode up next to James, looking uneasy but determined. "What are you doing, Horace?" Robert asked, his voice laced with frustration. "You're letting her ruin everything. She's bad luck. You know that." "I'm not asking for your approval," Horace said calmly, his voice colder than he intended. "And I'm certainly not asking for it now. You're on my land, and I'm telling you to leave." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. James's face darkened as he dismounted, taking a step toward Horace. "You're making a mistake, little brother," he sneered, his words laced with venom. "You've always been weak, but this is beyond stupid. You're going to get yourself killed over some woman who's nothing but trouble." Horace stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "You don't know anything about her. You left her to starve. I'm the one who had to pick up the pieces, not you." James took another step forward, his fists clenching. "You really think you know everything, don't you?" he spat. "She killed Marcus, and now you're following in his footsteps. You're doomed, Horace." The words hit like a blow to the chest, and for a moment Horace couldn't breathe. It wasn't true. He knew that. But the doubt, the fear, twisted inside him. He couldn't afford to let it show. "Marcus died in an accident," he said, his voice sharp and unwavering. "And if you really believe that she killed him, why would you leave her to suffer? Why would you abandon her, let her die?" The silence that followed was deafening. The wind whistled through the trees, but the tension between them was thick enough to slice through. James glared at him, but he didn't respond. Instead, Robert spoke, his voice low, almost desperate. "Horace, you don't know what you're doing. We're trying to protect you." "From what?" Horace asked, his voice rising with frustration. "From the truth? From the consequences of your own actions." Robert recoiled, clearly caught off guard by the force of Horace's words. "This isn't about you and her," James interjected, his voice low and dangerous. "This is about family. You're turning your back on us, on everything we've built. You're throwing it all away for her. You're a fool." "I've made my choice," Horace said, his voice quiet but firm. "And it's not for you to decide." He turned to walk toward the house, the confrontation feeling like it had reached its limit. But just as he stepped forward, he heard the sound of hooves again, this time closer than before. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. There were more riders, 4 of them, coming up the road fast. His blood ran cold. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he turned to face them, his mind racing. It wasn't just his brothers anymore. There was someone else involved. James looked past Horace, his face pale with realization. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath, just as the new riders approached. They weren't friends of his, that was for sure. They were men who had the look of hired guns, rough, weathered faces, hands resting on the guns at their sides. "James, Robert," the man in front said gruffly, his voice low and menacing. "We need to talk. Now." Horace turned his gaze back to his brothers, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't just about him and Alyssa anymore. This was bigger. They were all in danger. James and Robert exchanged uneasy looks before the man spoke again. his words cutting through the air like a blade. "We know you've been hiding things, and we know about Marcus's death." His eyes flicked to Horace, the meaning clear. Horace's blood ran cold. The secret of Marcus's death was about to come out, and it wasn't going to be pretty. He had a sinking feeling in his gut. The storm that had been brewing was finally here, and it was going to tear everything apart. The tension between Horace and his brothers thickened with every word that passed, and the arrival of the hired men only escalated the situation. His worst fears had come to life. This wasn't just about family betrayal anymore. The past few weeks had been a fragile peace, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. His brothers had been lying about Marcus's death, and the men who accompanied them were part of it. Horace's heart hammered in his chest as he realized the depth of the conspiracy. They had been hiding something much darker than he had imagined. As the hired men dismounted, their eyes narrowed, and the leader, a stocky, unshaven man, stepped forward. His voice was gravelly, filled with malice. "You've been a thorn in our side long enough, Horace. It's time to end this." His words were a direct threat, and the weight of it hit Horace like a cold wind. He glanced back toward the house, knowing Alyssa was inside, likely hearing everything, her safety now at risk. His mind raced. There was no turning back now. He wasn't going to let anyone harm her. His brothers had already done enough. He needed to protect her, and the only way to do that now was to face the truth, to confront whatever dark secret they had been keeping. "You're outnumbered," James sneered, his eyes hard and cold. "You're a fool if you think you can stop us. There's no escape from what's coming." The hired men closed in on Horace, their hands twitching near the holsters on their belts. Horace's eyes flicked between them, weighing his options, but his thoughts kept returning to Alyssa. He had promised to protect her, and now he would do whatever it took. His hand hovered near the rifle slung over his shoulder, his body tense and ready for whatever came next. James, seeing Horace's movement, grinned, his confidence unwavering. "You'll have to do better than that, brother," he said. "We're already one step ahead of you." In that instant, everything seemed to fall into place. Horace's mind clicked, and he understood. His brothers had orchestrated Marcus's death. They had made it look like an accident to cover up their own theft, their embezzlement. His pulse quickened as the pieces came together. Marcus had discovered their scheme and threatened to expose them. So they had killed him, staged the accident, and framed it as just another tragedy. The anger that surged through Horace was like wildfire. The realization of the betrayal hit him harder than any punch. These were his brothers, the men he had trusted, and they had murdered his own flesh and blood for money. They had let him live in ignorance, fed him lies, and now they wanted him to be part of the cover-up. No, Horace would never let them get away with it. His grip on the rifle tightened as he took a step forward, his voice cold with fury. "You killed Marcus," he said, his words steady but filled with rage. "You killed him to cover up your crimes. And now you think you can intimidate me into silence? Not a chance." The hired men looked at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They hadn't counted on Horace's strength or his conviction, but they were still outnumbered and the pressure was mounting. James took a step closer, his eyes narrowing with menace. "We didn't want it to go down like this," he said, his voice low. "But you forced our hand. I don't care about your excuses." Horace spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You killed Marcus for your greed, and now you'll answer for it." Before he could take another step, the hired men lunged at him, drawing their weapons. But Horace was quicker. With lightning speed, he pulled his rifle and fired, the shot ringing through the air. The man closest to him staggered back, clutching his shoulder, a howl of pain escaping his lips. The others hesitated, stunned by Horace's quick response. In that moment, the standoff broke into chaos. James barked orders, his voice shaking with fury. "Get him! Don't let him get away!" The hired men closed in, but Horace was ready. He ducked behind a nearby wagon, taking cover, his mind working overtime to formulate a plan. The men were closing in on him, their eyes scanning the area, but Horace had something they didn't: determination. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. He took another shot, this time hitting the ground near one of the men's feet, causing him to stumble back in fear. Horace knew he couldn't keep this up for long. He needed help. He needed a distraction. And then, as if on cue, he heard it. A sharp, piercing whistle from the edge of the property. Alyssa. She had heard the commotion and was coming to his aid. Her rifle fired, sending the hired men scattering, confusion spreading through their ranks. James, furious, turned to his brother. "What the hell are you doing, Horace?" he yelled. "This isn't over." Horace, using the distraction to his advantage, stepped out from behind the wagon, rifle raised. His voice was calm, but filled with the weight of the moment. "It's over, James. You've lost." His brother stood frozen, anger and fear battling in his eyes. The realization hit him like a blow. There was no escape from the truth anymore. Marcus's death would be exposed, and they would have to face the consequences. The hired men, seeing the writing on the wall, began to back off, their weapons lowered. James's face twisted in defeat as he watched Horace and Alyssa stand side by side, their eyes locked in quiet determination. They had won, but the victory came at a cost. Horace's chest heaved with exhaustion, his body sore from the confrontation. As the dust settled, Alyssa stepped forward, her hands shaking but her expression steady. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. Horace turned to her, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and sadness. "The worst of it is," he replied, his voice hoarse, "but we're not done yet. There's still justice to be served." The hired men were arrested soon after, taken to the sheriff's office to face the consequences of their actions. James and Robert, too, were led away in handcuffs, their faces grim as they realized the weight of what they had done. The trial was inevitable, but Horace knew they would never escape the truth. Marcus's death would not be forgotten. As he watched them being led away, he felt no satisfaction, no victory. He had done what needed to be done, but the road ahead would be long, and the pain of betrayal still lingered. "What happens now?" Alyssa asked quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. Horace looked at her, his eyes softening. "Now, we make sure it never happens again," he said. And together, they would rebuild, starting with the truth. It had been 3 months since the trial, and the heavy weight that had plagued Horace and Alyssa for so long was finally beginning to lift. The world around them seemed to breathe again, softer, quieter, the sharp edges of their past slowly dulling as they worked together to rebuild a life that, for a time, had seemed impossible. Horace's shoulder wound had healed, the stitches now nothing more than a faint scar, but it was the emotional scars that had taken longer to fade. Alyssa, too, was finding her own strength again. The nightmares had become less frequent, though they still occasionally stole her from sleep in the quiet hours of the night. When they woke in the morning, the first thing she saw was Horace beside her, his steady presence a reminder that she was no longer alone, that they were together, that they had made it through the worst of it. The morning routines were becoming second nature now. Alyssa would rise early, sometimes before the sun, and make breakfast while Horace tended to the animals. He would step inside, his boots heavy with the day's work, to find her humming as she stirred the pot on the stove, and the sight of her, healthy and vibrant again, filled him with something warm, something he hadn't realized he needed. She still wasn't the woman she had been before Marcus's death, but she was growing into something new, something strong. The laughter between them had become more frequent, no longer forced, but natural, even in the simplest moments. He'd catch her wiping her hands on her apron after a hard day's work, her hair falling loose around her face, and he'd find himself grinning like a fool, lost in the way she had become his world, how she made everything feel right again. The sense of domestic peace they had found was something neither of them had expected, but it was something neither of them was willing to lose. They had built something out of the wreckage of their pasts. A bond that had started with duty, had been tested by betrayal, and was now being forged in the fires of something more powerful than either of them had anticipated: love. Slowly, even the town's attitude began to shift. It had been a long road, but people who had once turned away from Alyssa were beginning to nod their heads in respect when they passed her on the street. At the general store, the woman who had once called her the cursed widow approached her hesitantly one day, her voice laced with guilt. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Horace," she said, her eyes downcast. "We were cruel to you, and I'm sorry." Alyssa, ever gracious, had simply smiled, accepting the apology. "Thank you for saying so," she replied quietly. She had no need for their acceptance anymore. She had Horace, and in his love, she had found something deeper than the judgments of others. Still, the small moments of kindness made her heart lighter, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could fit into this town that had once shunned her. The trial had been a dark but necessary chapter. Horace and Alyssa had attended the sentencing of James and Robert. The two brothers, now facing charges of manslaughter and theft, had been sentenced to 15 years in prison. Carl, the hired man who had helped them, had been sentenced to 5 years for his role in the conspiracy. The weight of those decisions had sat heavily on Horace's chest, but when it was over, when he had seen the guilty parties led away, there had been a sense of relief, a small flicker of peace. He would never be able to forget what they had done, but knowing that justice had been served gave him something he had lacked for so long: closure. As they left the courthouse, Alyssa had asked him, her voice soft, "Do you feel closure, Horace?" His gaze had been far away, but when he turned to her, he shook his head. "Not closure," he had answered, his voice gruff, "but justice. And that's enough for me." His parents had come to them after the trial, hesitant, unsure how to approach their son after all that had happened. His mother had been in tears, her voice shaky as she asked, "Tell me it isn't true, Horace. Tell me this isn't what your brothers did." His father stood behind her, his face lined with grief and regret. Horace had met their gazes, but there was no anger in his eyes anymore, only a sense of quiet resolve. "It's true," he said softly, his voice steady but distant. "They killed Marcus, and they nearly killed Alyssa and me. You were blind to it, and I can't forget that." His mother's sobs had broken something in him, but his heart had already hardened, the years of silence between them more than he could forgive an instant. Still, he found himself looking at his father, whose eyes were filled with the same helpless regret. "We had no idea about any of it," his father had said, his voice thick with sorrow. Horace had nodded, but there was no way to take back the damage done. "You abandoned Alyssa, left her to starve." The words had come out colder than he had meant, but they had been true. His parents had failed her just as much as his brothers had failed him. His mother, still crying, had reached out, her voice broken. "Can you ever forgive us, Horace?" she had asked. "We failed you both." Horace had hesitated. "Maybe someday," he had said, the words coming out slower than he had intended. "But not now. Not until you prove to me that you understand what you've done. You abandoned your daughter-in-law. I can't forgive that easily." He had taken Alyssa's hand and walked away, leaving them behind to face the consequences of their actions. He wasn't sure what the future would hold for his relationship with his parents, but he knew one thing for certain: Alyssa was his family now, and he would protect her at all costs. Life had a strange way of turning things upside down, of forcing people into unexpected situations, and for Horace and Alyssa, the surprises weren't over yet. A month after the trial, Alyssa had started to feel different, tired, nauseous. At first, she had brushed it off as the lingering effects of stress, but it had become impossible to ignore. One morning, she had ridden into town to visit the doctor, her heart pounding with an anxious hope she hadn't dared allow herself before. When the doctor confirmed her suspicion, the world had tilted beneath her feet. "You're with child, Mrs. Horace." About 6 weeks along, he had said, his voice warm but matter of fact. Alyssa had held her breath, her hand trembling as it rested on her stomach. A baby. She hadn't dared think about it, not after everything they had been through. But the joy that flooded through her in that moment was undeniable. She had returned home, her heart heavy with the secret she had yet to share with Horace. When she arrived, he was working in the barn, his back to her as she stood in the doorway, watching him. She couldn't keep it to herself any longer. She had never wanted to burden him with more, but this was different. She had to tell him. She had prepared a special dinner that night, her hands shaking as she set the table. She couldn't hold the secret any longer. As they sat down, the tension between them had shifted, but it wasn't from the weight of anything bad. It was something new, something filled with promise. "What's the occasion?" Horace had asked, his eyes glancing up at her as he took a bite of stew. "Can I spoil my husband a little?" she had replied, her voice teasing, but her eyes filled with something deeper. She had waited until the meal was done, the evening drawing to a close, before she had finally taken a deep breath. "Horace," she had started, her voice trembling, "I have something to tell you." His gaze had softened, his expression full of concern. "What is it, Alyssa? Are you all right?" he had asked. And then, with a smile that had filled her heart with warmth, she had finally whispered, "I'm more than all right. We're having a baby." The silence that followed had been filled with a million unsaid words. Horace had stared at her, his face going slack with shock, and then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, the brightest smile she had ever seen. "Really?" he had asked, his voice thick with emotion. "A baby?" She had nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, really." He had risen from his chair and spun her around in a joyful embrace, both of them laughing and crying in equal measure. "We're going to be parents," he had said, his voice filled with awe. And in that moment, Alyssa had known that they were going to be okay, that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, their hearts finally at peace. The months that followed had brought even more surprises as Alyssa's belly grew, and they began preparing for the future in ways they never imagined. Pastor John had come by to help with the construction of a nursery for the baby, and the simple act of expanding their home had felt like the beginning of something new, something full of hope. Alyssa had begun teaching children in town, her dream of becoming a school teacher finally realized, and Horace had expanded the ranch, hiring fair workers to help with the workload. Their lives had blossomed in ways neither of them had expected. The love between them had deepened, and with the arrival of their son, Samuel, their world felt complete. When Samuel had been born, the midwife had placed him in Horace's arms, and he had wept with joy, his heart swelling with a love he never knew was possible. They had named him Samuel, a symbol of a fresh start, a new beginning. The days that followed had been filled with the soft sounds of their son's cries, the joy of their new family, and the quiet realization that everything they had fought for had been worth it. The world outside had faded away, and there was only this love, this family, this future they had built together. As the seasons changed, so too did their lives. The ranch had grown, and their hearts had healed. Alyssa had found purpose in teaching the children of the town, and Horace had found joy in the everyday moments that once seemed so far out of reach. Their family had become a beacon of hope in the small town, and together, they had created a future that was stronger than the pain of their past. As they stood together on the porch one evening, watching the sunset over the fields, Horace had pulled Alyssa close, his arm wrapped around her. "I never thought I'd be here," he had said quietly, his voice full of wonder. "But I'm so glad I am." She had smiled, looking up at him, her heart full. "Me too," she had whispered. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood there, together, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that no matter what, they had everything they needed right here, together. And that was enough.